Man leaves wife and triplets after DNA test. Years later, he turns pale when he sees them. John and Sandra were a perfect couple, and they were looking forward to sharing the rest of their lives together. When they unexpectedly became pregnant with triplets, they knew that their life was about to change completely. John was starting to have serious doubts about his family. He could not ignore the fact that their children looked nothing like him. When he confronts his wife about it, she denies everything. So John decides to take matters into his own hands and do a DNA test. When he hears the results, his world falls apart. The DNA test shows that he is not the triplets' father, and since his wife continues to deny ever cheating on him, he decides to leave her. One day, he sees them again, and he discovers something that turns his whole world upside down. John and Sandra had been married for a couple of years when they discovered that she was pregnant. They were both overjoyed to hear this news. When they heard that they were going to have triplets, at first, they were completely shocked. They were also a little worried because none of them had raised a baby before. As the pregnancy progressed, they converted a spare room in their house into a nursery. They really enjoyed picking out all the furniture and buying clothes and other things for their babies. The 9 months passed before they even realized it. One day, Sandra's water broke, and John quickly drove her to the hospital. That same day, 3 beautiful babies were born. The new parents were adjusting to their new life with 3 babies at home. They were doing a good job, and they quickly got used to their new lifestyle. But then, John started to notice something that he couldn't ignore. The babies looked nothing like him. He tried to convince himself that they were still too young. One evening, once they had put the babies to bed, John sat down next to Sandra and asked her if they could talk. He explained what had been on his mind. She was furious. She asked John if he was serious, and when he said that he was, she completely exploded with anger. And even though he felt bad for hurting his wife, he realized that she had never actually denied what he had said. Why hadn't she answered his question? He thought about it for a while, and he decided that the best thing he could do was a DNA test. The next day, he delivered all the DNA samples to the lab. The only thing he could do now was wait for the doctor to call him back with the results. He still had no idea what to expect, but he hoped they would be a match. Days passed, and he barely spoke to his wife. They only talked when they had to discuss something about their children. These days were the most difficult for him. Every time he looked at his kids, he couldn't help but think of the test, and what would happen if his suspicions were confirmed. One day, John's phone finally rang. It was the doctor. He quickly locked himself in the bathroom and held his breath as he answered the phone. John's heart was beating in his chest, and his hands were shaking as he listened to the voice that was coming through the phone. And then, the doctor finally told him what the test results had shown him. The test showed that John was not the father. He was not related to the babies in any way. Upon hearing this, his world collapsed. He was heartbroken. How could Sandra have done this to him? He thought she loved him. John decided that he needed to confront Sandra about it. He hoped that she would be honest with him now and give him the answers that he asked for. However, Sandra kept denying everything. She told him that she would never be unfaithful and that she would never do something like that to their family. A few months later, the divorce was finalized. John had left Sandra and the triplets, and even though it hurt him, he thought he had made the right decision. He still loved the triplets, and he would do so until the day he died, but he was not ready to raise a family with the woman he loved after she had betrayed him in such a way. To John, the worst thing was that Sandra never admitted what she had done. She kept denying everything until the end, and she had begged John to stay, but he refused. John moved into an apartment in the city, and Sandra stayed in the house with her children. Years passed, and they never heard from each other again, because he hadn't just lost his kids, but also the love of his life. John started falling into some bad habits, and he started drinking a lot more than he should. One day, John planned on going to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, but before he was even able to do that, someone unexpectedly showed up on his doorstep. When he opened the door, he saw that it was Sandra. She looked horrible, like she had been crying a lot. John was a bit embarrassed about the mess in his apartment, but he invited her in anyway. She came inside and took place on a chair at the kitchen table. She looked at him, and the tears were streaming down her face. "John, I don't know where to begin," she whispered. It was about the triplets. Michael turned pale. He did not say or do anything. He just froze and stared into the distance. Finally, he was able to speak. "You're kidding me, right? This had to be some kind of horrible joke." John realized that she was speaking the truth, and he didn't know how to feel. He didn't know whether he wanted to laugh or cry, so he just hugged her. "Where do we need to go now?" he asked her, and she told him that someone was waiting for them at the police station. They got in her car as fast as they could, and she drove them to the station. As Sandra opened the folder and peeked inside, she told John, "I haven't seen these yet. I wanted to do it together with you." He nodded, and she took something out of the folder. John did not know what he was looking at. All the pictures were of people who didn't seem to be aware of the fact that they were being photographed. Why was she showing this to him? Who were these people? What? How? Are they? He wanted to ask so many questions, but he could finish none of them. John burst out crying. "What are we going to do now? We cannot just walk up to them and tell them what happened, right?" he asked. And Sandra replied, "Well, I don't know. That's why I brought you here. Once I found out the truth, I contacted Mr. Cooper and asked him to track them down. I wanted to see how they were doing before I did anything that I could never take back." She finally looked up at him with tears in her eyes and said, "At least now you know I've always been honest with you." And John suddenly felt so sorry for her. As the years passed, Sandra started noticing something about the triplets. They indeed looked nothing like John, but they looked nothing like her either. And once she realized this, she just could not let it go. Again, you see, Sandra had made a shocking discovery. After John took that DNA test and it showed negative results, she was determined to find out what was going on, so she did another DNA test, but this time with her own DNA. And when Sandra saw those test results, she finally realized what had happened. The triplets had been switched with other triplets in the hospital as babies just after they were born. She was heartbroken when she found out, and she knew she needed to tell John immediately. Would they tell their own kids about this or not? They deserved to know, but how much good would this do them? Sandra and John decided to take some time to think about this. Now that they knew what had really happened, they had plenty of things to talk about. Over time, they would fix their relationship and make a decision that they both agreed on, telling the triplets the truth or keeping them safe from it. The most important thing was that they at least had each other again, and they would get through this together.